Thank you very much for the chance to join you. Maureen and I are going to, work together to really kind of connect some of the mental health space that I work in, the education space that Maureen has been just a phenomenal leader in over the years, and try to, facilitate a conversation, and then we hope have some time for Q&A with the audience. So if you've got some questions, write them down and be ready. There's a mic over here. And there's a mic over here. We won't have a lot of time, but we want to certainly allow you the chance to ask some questions in response to these key leaders. What I love about this talk, and I think I like the way Bruce, as a neuroscientist, raised this issue. Everyone is different, right? We certainly see that in the mental health space, where we think about how we tailor care, how we need to tailor care, but often we struggle to tailor care to the needs of folks. Better care is cheaper. Raise your hand if that really resonates with you, right? We often don't think of that. We don't design systems that way, right? We think about spending less money is cheaper. And so, we try to focus on cheaper through policy, through fiscal policy, rather than through programmatic strategies. And I think we heard that in Tina's comments around education. I love the story about how we designed, what did you say, the last time we redesigned our educational system was 100 years ago? Something along those lines. More than 100 years ago. Yeah. We're good at this, right? And then, of course, social determinants of health. And I love the honesty that says, at first, I didn't believe and I didn't participate, right? But I think the example is really compelling. Well, I'm going to have to ask him if listening to books on tape is just as good as reading, because it's easier to do while I sleep and run. So part of the challenge that I think we see at the Mental Health Commission is all of these issues that the three of you have raised, and invite Laura into this as well. As Elizabeth said, push against the current, right? Our systems aren't designed to tailor care. They're not designed to be dynamically responsive to the science that is evolving. As Steve points out, these ideas were generated that seem so intuitive now, but they were counterintuitive at the time, that we have to, and as David says, what in the world is the lawyer doing at the table, right? But made the case that the lawyer needs the law school, that policy, that the structures, the intellectual structures that we build into our practice and policy are important. So I want to ask the panel, if we can take these lessons back to policymakers, if those of us in the room that work in policy, whether it's at the state level or at the local level, how can we begin to rethink about the way we design our systems? Breaking Barriers has done a phenomenal job in pointing out that the system builds barriers. How can we begin to create incentives, to create improved awareness, strategies, so that we're not actively designing a system that we're then having to then dismantle at the same time, right? How do we begin to actually learn some of the lessons that you've brought to us to begin to put in place not just one-time investments, but begin designing systems so they're tapping into the educational history, the policy and the legal work, the science of neurodiversity and brain health, so that our systems are getting better inherently. Just challenge the panel here to think a little bit about what does we as a policy community do differently?
So I'm happy to start. I think the key is putting people in the same room together. I think that a lot of what happens in terms of initiatives happens organically. I'll give you a very quick example. When we were founding the consortium with UCSF, the very first research project that we had was a group of geriatric and palliative care physicians from UCSF that wanted to rewrite the advanced directives for end-of-life care. And so they wanted to do a 50-state survey to see what the legal standards and frameworks were around the country, and they had a $25,000 grant from the VA. And so we put together a team of faculty and students, and we met with the geriatric and palliative care physicians to go through it all. And one day we were just talking and we asked, well, tell us a little bit about your patients. And they said, well, they're older, they're having cognitive challenges, they have landlords that are trying to throw them out because they're in rent-controlled apartments, they have mold problems, but they can't get that solved, they have disability problems. And every time they said something, we said, they need a lawyer for that. Of course, that's the way we think. But we said, you need a lawyer for that, and it's the social determinants of health point. And we thought, in that moment, why not put a legal clinic in an operating medical clinic and provide an attorney for those patients? And it is not, we created it. We got all the MOUs from the medical center, from the medical school. We created it. There's one now at the senior center on Geary and Arguello in San Francisco. And there's an additional one now at the VA, and one just opened up at San Francisco General. So there are now 3 medical legal partnerships for seniors where Hastings law students are at the clinic and available, and the physicians are taught issue spotting at the beginning of the semester, and the physicians like it so much that they actually write a prescription to their patients to see a lawyer. And there are not that many contexts where seeing a lawyer is good for your health, but this is very much one of them. And it all happened organically because we just put a group of problem solvers in a room together, and they identified a problem, and they came up with a solution. So I think that having the resources to put everybody in the room together is a really good start.
And David, is this on? Can you hear me okay?
I have to push that.
I have to push which? Oh, this button.
No.
It goes up.
I'll grab it. There you go.
Okay, that's better, yes. Thanks. Problem solving, collaborative problem solving. I was just going to toss in as the medical representative on the group along with Dr. Miller, but on the healthcare side, when I hear comments like that, what I like to toss in just for context for people, in healthcare now, there's a very commonly cited statistic that only 20% of traditional healthcare outcomes are determined by traditional healthcare. Right? And that 80%, which includes environmental, behavioral, social, emotional, kind of contextual issues, so social determinants of health, are responsible for 80% of health outcomes. So I like to give that as a framing for this. And then it sort of makes you think, well, no kidding, it would make sense to have legal support services integrated into medical care and things. We just haven't done it because we've got a lot of barriers to break down to do that. But just keep that 80%, 20% in mind, because it's a pretty stunning one, I think.
I'm going to bring, can you all hear me? Sorry.
It's this top one.
This top one.
No, a little light should go on.
Oh, I think when one is on, the other goes, like only one can be on at the same time?
I don't know.
I don't know about that. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to take us back. And I'm going to suggest that this starts with young people in classrooms. What we're talking about here is thinking about how we approach problems differently than how any of us in this room were taught to do so as young children. Children sitting at desks in classrooms, let's go back to that one-room classroom, let's go back to the 6-3-3 model. That's not how you teach a child to solve a problem. You teach a child to solve a problem out in the world, on the ground, with their hands in the dirt, asking questions. And a good teacher facilitates that knowledge. And then that good teacher is able to see the child who actually works a whole heck of a lot better outside in the dirt. That's my child. And then they notice the child who in fact does so much better in a classroom, in a soft space, with a book. But you put those children together and you ask them to solve a problem, and they can do it. They're going to save our planet. We're not. Okay? So you start there. So what's critical is teaching teachers and other educators how to do this work. And what you're noticing is that the relationships matter. So that to address the issue of the child, who might have some impulse control issues, you then need to bring in a behavioral specialist. I'm not arguing that the teacher should be that person, but I'm arguing that that person should be available to the teacher, that that person should be part of the whole school community, and that they should be able to work together spontaneously in that moment. So what Bruce talks about is precision learning, right? And that people talk about this in education. You talk to a teacher, and their head just hits the table. And they say, how do I teach each individual child? And that is not what we're suggesting. What we're suggesting is identifying which children might have a very specialized need and making sure that we have the interventions and the intervention specialists who can help that child before we get to the place where we're 45 years old and we look at a scan of the brain and we see this enormous deficit in some area of the brain. And that helps our kids from needing people like our esteemed colleague over here, the Chancellor of the law school. But it is important to integrate those. So at that community school that I talked about, we have a sister school, which is a K-12 school, a span school. And it's in an immigrant community. And what we noticed was that we had a lot of families who were very frightened to come onto campus. We need family engagement. And that's because so many of them were undocumented. So we partnered with our law school, and we now have an immigration clinic on that campus. So it's being responsive, it's building relationships, it's figuring out what you need to recruit to help solve your problem and to retain it, but to also be responsive and flexible in it. You can't have the silos, and the silos can harden so that you can't penetrate beyond them. Again, the breaking barriers. That's probably a bit too much.
And Bruce needs a turn too.
So I love the way Toby framed the question. I think the question is the big one, which is ultimately how are we all effective in transforming California? A few, and I love the answers that people have given, all different dimensions, and I think that's part of the solution, is it isn't one of us in our own silo, but it is multidisciplinary. Just a comment about how we've approached this with our Global Brain Health Program. So every year we have 20 fellows from places like Belo Horizonte, Brazil, different parts of Mexico, now Africa, Ethiopia, thinking with us for a year. We have 20 at UCSF, 20 in Dublin, and they're all together through Zoom. We use what you have learned through child education, the CON method, so that no slides, they read the material before they come in, then we start talking, and that's where the electricity is. But we were asked when we put this program together by Chuck Feeney, who was the silent philanthropist, he said, you can't do it with physicians alone. You need to start training people in health economics who can talk to politicians, who can explain to them why this is cost effective to do it properly. The other part that we learned is we were told you have to bring artists in. They tell our stories much better than we do. So we have had bluegrass fiddler who is fiddling about aging at Hardly Strictly Bluegrass. We have had a raconteur, Josh Kornbluth, develop a video which you should all watch on the empathy circuit. We have had an opera made by one of our fellows about her mother with Alzheimer's disease. So these artists have told our story in such a powerful way. And I think the genius of Steve and all of you in bringing someone like Goldie Hawn into the mix is that they resonate with the public, and they can help us make a difference. But it's a constant push and struggle to get what we're doing front and center. It's important. It means everything. And just one last comment. So we had about 5 years ago, $500 million from the NIH to support aging research. It really wasn't enough. Ron Peterson at Mayo Clinic and the Alzheimer's Association, Maria Carrillo, said, we have to double this. And they set as a goal $1 billion. If you don't set these goals, it never happens. Much to my surprise, we now have almost $4 billion at the NIH. It's, for the first time, enough money to really start to make a dent in these disorders. Expensive, but we have to set these high goals. We must articulate plans that will work. And even if they're crazy ambitious, that's what California is all about. That's why we're all here.
Boy, let's applaud that one, huh? So I get to ask a question, and as you heard, I am an educator. I am specifically a special education expert, or at least I have a long history of working in special education. And so we, of course, serve birth to 22 in California. And first, I should say, I loved how many words you used about integration, multidisciplinary, doing things together. All of those things are so critical to actually making a difference for children and their families. And I absolutely believe that we need to do it. However, I have a sense of urgency. And my big question is about how do you take all this? You have great ideas for San Francisco right now, but we have 6 million kids in California and this huge system. So my question is about how do you take research to practice in a way that can happen day to day? And I'll give you one quick example. In the California legislature, we used to have 2 to 5 days set aside in a budget for professional development days for teachers. That's a really practical example of something that could make a difference, because we could say, you have to provide this kind of training that you're talking about. So that's just one example, but I'd love to hear from each of you your ideas about that.
So I'll jump in to quickly say, and I can tell you, if you want a quick version of what I thought was going to really contribute to exactly what you're talking about, is I think we need shared language if we're going to put a whole bunch of people in a room together who don't even speak the same language but may have shared goals. So that's a big one. The other thing, as a pediatrician, so I always say, listen, I thought I might want to be a neurosurgeon. I always loved the neurosciences. I was going to be a math major, and I majored in cellular molecular biology. And I went from that all the way to writing books on potty training and brushing teeth, and people thought I was a very nice, warm, Midwestern pediatrician mom, right? But the thing was, how do you integrate all that and convince people? I always say I'm not just an early childhood person, but I'm a root cause person. So then I said, a lot of times early childhood doesn't even get kind of added into that discussion, right? I mean, we all know it, but we don't always talk about it. I expressly set out several years ago to say, how am I going to convince business and policymakers, specifically, that this is worth investing in? And it incorporates, I was so excited to hear all of you in terms of your talks, because how do you synthesize all of that? And then someone says, and can you do it in 14 minutes? That is the TED Talk I gave that Steve referenced, which is helping, what do kids need to succeed, 21st century skills for success or something like that. You can just Google my name. But here's what I'll tell you, based on what you just heard, helping people understand why this is important. Like, great, everybody loves kids. I use the example, I live in Omaha, Nebraska. It's like convincing people to save the whales. It's not that people don't like whales, but you couldn't be further from water on the continental United States if you tried. And so all of a sudden, it's now complex thinking, right? It's systems level and multiple inputs and factors over time. That's where I say, we are now faced with a complex challenge, customize and personalize at the exact same time that we operationalize and scale. We're coming out of more than a century's worth of, we were aiming for one size fits all with our educational efforts, right? It was the industrial era. You wanted to make widgets and you wanted them all to come out on an assembly line as fast as possible and exactly the same. So we try to switch over, we've got a big task at hand. Even just saying that to people, it makes a light bulb go off. We can see where we're having to shift. And then we need common language. And Tina just mentioned a bunch of the things that we care about and how kids learn best. In that TED Talk I gave, here's what I framed it. First of all, the expression relationships matter is the tagline for LinkedIn. You want to get people in California to pay attention to you. I always say if you can quote, some of the big companies here, technology, people like that, you can quote things. Again, I went for the Star Wars reference, whatever you can do. But people intuitively know that sitting crisscross applesauce on a single spot on a circle rug, don't touch, don't poke, don't grab, isn't really the best way to learn anything. I also owned a child care center for 10 years, so I learned the language. But what I did was I said, everybody wants to talk about jobs, workforce, future of work, skills. take those skills and say, we all agree on those skills. Here they are. I've given it a talk over 100 times. Communication, collaboration, teamwork, adaptability, resilience, grit, perseverance, emotional intelligence, the ability to fail and adapt, right? All of those skills. And all you have to do is say, here's what they look like in early childhood, take your pick of age, and oh, by the way, cool brain science to back it up. And I can tell you by doing that framing, and that way, because again, I was trying to get to business and policymakers, that has gotten me to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the World Bank annual meeting, the British Parliament to testify on why it's important to invest in early childhood. So what I see in this collaborative effort, interagency, data sharing, brain science, law, education, is hugely powerful if you can come together, figure out your shared language. You do have shared goals, you just have to identify what they are and make sure you all can call them the same thing, and then go forward with that. So that's my big picture for you, as quick as I could.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just a really quick example of what we're doing in the state in Alzheimer's. So there are 10 state centers of excellence. So important, I think, that people can get the final definitive word on what their illness is, how to treat it. So we realized that's not enough. I mean, these 10 centers just touch a fraction of the elders in the state who have cognitive issues. So there are two initiatives that are going on through these state centers that translate this urgently. One is, this isn't super complicated. I think we have thanks. We have principles that we've put out to all of the physicians across California about how you diagnose and treat Alzheimer's disease. So there is a constant teaching going on to all of the physicians across the state of California. You can imagine something like this with centers of excellence for dyslexia. The other thing that we have done, and this is led by Howie Rosen, is we have set up connections with practices across the state through the state centers. And these people will tune in with our experts. You know, I think teachers and physicians are among the loneliest people in the world. They're really isolated. They really want to connect. And so this gives them the opportunity to talk over the most difficult cases that they're seeing with a group of experts. So this is a very specific example of translating better care in California across the entire state via simple educational modules. Fedra Bell, who's in the room, is working in the most underserved communities across the state, bringing, you know, sophisticated diagnosis to the schools. There's so much we can do to translate this, and if we just touch an elite group of people, it doesn't mean a thing.
Thank you. Do either of you have something you want to add?
I'll just add, this is maybe a little bit of a confession. I started teaching back in 1987, and I've written a lot of articles and a lot of books. William Prosser, who's a great torts professor back in the 60s, said that sometimes when he wrote an article, it felt like it dropped into the ocean with hardly a ripple. And I often feel that way about my writing. My area of expertise is the use of scientific research and legal decision-making. And one of the areas I've worked in is forensic science, fingerprints, firearms, handwriting, bite marks, things like that. And I recently ended up testifying in a few cases involving firearms, which I've been writing on for 25 years. And literally within 6 months, there were several decisions that restricted the use of firearms identification because the research basis was terrible. And to your point, I think you need to do more than disseminate the knowledge. You need to be in the room, you need to be talking to people, and you need them to be invested in what you're talking about because they are going to own it. And so I do think the Bench to School Initiative and the California Institute on Law, Neuroscience, and Education is intended to do that. It starts out with the 3 campuses, but I think to Bruce's point, it has great ambitions. It's going to broaden and filter into other contexts, but I think you need to engage people directly in order for them to change behavior. Because, it's easy to do what we've always done, because we've done it. To change is hard.
Right, thank you.
I'll just add to that. You know that he never gets selected for jury duty, right? I mean, wow. I once edited a book called What Counts as Credible Evidence in Evaluation and Applied Research, and that was my ticket out of jury duties. So his is, his is the real thing. I would add that, and I've seen this happen so often in schools, and I'm sure you can relate to this. So we say we've got this great model, and the teacher's like, they look at you like, again, we have another great model, okay, what's this one? And what we need to promise people is that we're changing how we think about what we're doing and then how we're doing it. And so we need to inspire teachers, educators, school counselors in their training programs. Okay, so we talk about inspiring kids in classrooms, and I'll be the first to say that you walk into some of the classrooms in our building, and you think, this is terribly boring, right? This is not that interesting. So we really have to rethink how we engage in teaching and learning throughout the system. And we can't just say it's enough to, here's a community school model. Okay, we're doing that in the state. Huge investment in community schools. I'm 100% behind it. There must be technical assistance. And the technical assistance has to be not just, here's how you do this, here's a manual, but rather, what does it mean for us in our school? And when we hit that first barrier, and we're going to hit it, when the pothole appears in the road, how do we patch it, move around it, or say, you know what, we have to live with this pothole. But we're going to think about what we can do so that when we drive over it, it doesn't pop our tire. So these are the kinds of things that I think from a policy perspective we need to be thinking through. Centers of excellence, technical assistant hubs, who's leading those? Are they multidisciplinary? Are they integrated? It isn't really enough to say, okay, UCLA, you be the technical assistance center, without saying you must engage the CSUs, you must engage the UCs. Oh, and also importantly, are the community colleges. I mean, I say this, most of our neurodiverse learners who get caught, who get stuck, are getting stuck at the community college. And they're leaving the community colleges, right? And they're struggling with their own retention rates. So how are we teaching at the community college level? What is the engagement? And it really has to come from a place of compassion, equity, and it needs to be informed, as I said, by scientific evidence, brain research, developmental research, and the learning sciences.
All right, we've got about 10 minutes left, so there's time for a couple of questions from the audience. But I just want to challenge, I wouldn't be doing my job as on behalf of the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission if I didn't, point out and challenge you a little bit in terms of what the Mental Health Services Act calls for under the prevention and early intervention language of the Act. If you're not aware, it says this is really about preventing homelessness and incarceration and the dissolution of families through child welfare involvement. It's about preventing suicide and unemployment. And it even says to prevent prolonged suffering. So, the law is really quite elegant. And it has this innovation component as well that says we've got $100 million a year to try something, right? And this, I translate personally that to say I'd rather come from a place where we're trying to get better by using these resources and taking risks than come from a place where we've decided to give up, that the system we have today is adequate. Because if you look around our community, it's not adequate. And if we look around the panel today, they've inspired in terms of the opportunity for science, for law, for policy and practice. So, thinking about who's in the room, the opportunity that we have in California, as someone mentioned, we've got some of the best minds in the world when it comes to communications with Hollywood. We have some of the best minds in the world when it comes to technology and innovation with Silicon Valley and all of the companies and the expertise that we have there. We have some of the best legal minds in California, as evidenced by, at least by the dean we have with us today. But certainly the research potential of the University of California system, the reach of our community colleges is unparalleled in the country, right? The capacity to leverage our schools as the place where the public sector most touches every California family, right? But also the place where trust is very high. So I think for me, this panel is about opportunity and hope, and it's about this notion of how do we begin to do the kind of tailoring that Bruce has called for, to do the kind of technical assistance and support that has come out of this panel. So as you came to Breaking Barriers, Elizabeth often talks about this isn't she said I to we, right? So come up to the mic if you've got a question, you've got a couple of minutes. Challenge this panel to help us think about how we move from where we are today to where we want to be on behalf of the children, families, and communities that got all of you to come to Sacramento in April for a face-to-face meeting.
I know how important it is to actually ask a question, but I have a comment and just a little bit of experience. This is my first conference of this sort. I come from the world of pediatric palliative care. And David, you mentioned palliative care, and I want to say that whole notion of changing the scope of palliative care and the cost neutrality of it came from pediatrics. So we started with a coalition, and it was a group of people that came together, including, and Tina, you mentioned teacher resistance to change, perhaps. It included the nurses, the doctors, the Children's Hospital Association, and the state. Thank you. And you're probably familiar with this, Toby. We revolutionized the access to care, but it took a coalition and the buy-in from everyone's efforts. And we had to prove, which we did, that better care cost less. And now this program is being adopted by the adult world. So in education, when we're thinking about the levels of commitment and the levels of resistance and making the case, let's look to places like palliative care where we've already done that, use it as a model, and then go out from there. It works.
That's great. One of the things that we planners of this conference wanted to ensure you had the opportunity to do was to ask questions, not just now, but throughout our 3 days. And because every time you finish a conference, you start planning the next one, right, Elizabeth? So we want you to be thinking about what else do you need? What would you like to see? What else could we be doing for you? What are your takeaways from this? And we'll be putting up those questions for you as we go. And this was just my opportunity to make sure that we at least introduced that idea early. But mostly now, I'd really like to thank this panel for your incredible information and support and articulation and great ideas. And I'd like to ask folks to join me in thanking them.